Good morning, and welcome to my classroom. After asking his men to stay for one last effort, General George Washington devised a daring plan to stun the British, capture supplies, and reinvigorate American morale during the American Revolution. Washington's decision to attack positions in New Jersey was motivated by two factors. One was the desire to instill confidence in his soldiers with a sneak attack and a victory. The second being the fear of losing a large portion of his army, as many of the enlisted contracts of his soldiers were scheduled to expire in 6 days. Washington's army crossed the icy Delaware River on Christmas Day, 1776, and on the following morning, the Continental Army won a crucial battle in the War for Independence. In the Battle of Trenton, George Washington defeated a formidable garrison of 1,400 Hessian mercenaries who the British had hired to fight against the Americans. Washington was able to defeat the Hessians in only 1 hour of fighting. His army of about 2,400 soldiers captured nearly 900 Hessian soldiers, as well as a large supply of muskets, bayonets, swords, and cannons, as the Continentals were invigorated by the easy defeat of the British Hessian forces. The victory at the Battle of Trenton, which was followed by another victory at Princeton 8 days later, was a major turning point in the war. After months of defeat and retreat for the American army, this victory changed the morale of both the army and the country. So how was General George Washington able to turn the tide of the war and defeat the Hessians at the Battle of Trenton? All right. Was his victory at Trenton due to the brilliance of his plan, the effort of his subordinates, or the incompetence of the Hessian soldiers? My research will focus on George Washington's brilliant strategy and how his superior leadership skills enabled him to motivate his dilapidated army to stay for one final battle and defeat the Hessians at Trenton. This victory was preceded by crippling defeats in New York, and with the Continentals on the run with very little supplies, this is what makes the Battle of Trenton and Washington's accomplishments that much more impressive. Many would argue that the Continentals had their numerical advantage was the reason for the victory, which is only partially true. Many of the Continental soldiers had very little experience in battle compared to their Hessian counterparts. In the case of Trenton, quality helped, but it was Washington's leadership and the brilliance of his plan that enabled them to win. The primary sources I will be using for my research project consist of several letters written by Washington to John Hancock, updating the Continental Congress on the progress of the war and the state of the Army. These letters are dated from November 1776 to January 1777, following the victory at Princeton. Some of the secondary sources I'll use for my project and my research, a book called The Contemporaries Account of the Battle of Trenton by G. Bickham, and journal articles, one named The Crossing, the Trenton and Princeton Campaign of 76 and 77 by Stuart Lieberger, and a journal entitled Colonel Roll at Trenton by Andreas Wiederhold. The Battle of Trenton was a major turning point in the Revolutionary War. Washington was forced to retreat to New Jersey, where his army was in shambles on the verge of defeat. He was somehow to convince them to extend their enlistments and fight one last battle. The victory at Trenton enabled them to continue, which led to another victory at Princeton, and these victories gave the Americans the will and the confidence to continue the war and eventually defeat the British in the War for Independence. It was George Washington who was responsible for that.